How does Doctrine and Covenants 89 actually hold up?
You hear about a study on green tea and cancer prevention.
Nicotine does actually have genuine anti-parasitic properties. People who drink a moderate amount of coffee tend to live longer than people who don't.
And you wonder quietly, so what do I do with that?
Some of the most prominent physicians during this era were actually unwittingly killing their patients.
He didn't have the epidemiology. He didn't have the mechanistic biology, and yet the text says clearly tobacco is not for the body.
Well established now in medical practice, not established at all in 1833.
Faith is not the absence of tension with evidence. It's the willed orientation maintained in the presence of it.
Here's why we still continue to observe this anyway. The reason isn't primarily medical.
Hi, Scott.
Hello, Casey.
And here we are. We've made it to our very last episode on the history of the Word of Wisdom, and we've solved everything. This will never come up again. This is the last conversation you'll ever have to listen to about the Word of Wisdom, right?
Yeah, nice try. Nice try. No, it is our last episode, Casey, and there's probably 10 more episodes we could do on this topic, I feel like. But
that's like every topic, right? We just have to, we've got to be more disciplined, to be honest with you, but that's okay.
But I mean, I think this is only episode 6 in this series, so I feel like we did good. This is our last episode, and it's only 6. So good job, us. And to be honest, Casey, this episode is one that I've been both looking forward to and slightly dreading.
We've spent our series exploring the history of the Word of Wisdom, the 1833 context, the cultural world Joseph Smith was living in, how the Word of Wisdom evolved over the 19th and 20th centuries into what it is today. And we even tackled the caffeine question in our last episode. And all of that was what we'll call the history of the Word of Wisdom. But in this episode, we're going to do something a little bit different.
Yeah, in this episode, we're going to ask the question that a lot of members quietly ask. Sometimes they ask it out loud. I've had conversations with people about questions along this line, which is basically this. How does Doctrine and Covenants 89 actually hold up, like medically, scientifically? When you take it seriously as a document that makes health claims and you compare those claims to the best available evidence that we have in 2026, what do we find, right? And what I want our listeners to know from the outset is that we're doing this as like serious students of the scriptures and as people of faith. And we're doing this because we think that an honest engagement with these questions is actually more faith promoting than the alternative. The faithful response to hard questions, Casey, we've tried to model in this entire podcast is it's best to just hit them head on rather than try to avoid them, right? It's better to engage them than to just pretend like they don't exist. So that's why we want to do this today.
Yeah, well said. Well said. So let's get into it. And Scott, before we start going provision by provision, I want to frame why this question even matters. But because some people's reaction to the premise of this episode might be, why are we doing this at all? Why are we submitting scripture to a scientific tribunal?
Yeah. And that's fair pushback. And it's worth taking seriously for a minute. I mean, even in our last episode, right, we tried to show how a purely scientific approach to the Word of Wisdom, which was popular from like the 1930s and 40s on, is probably not the best approach, right? It's not recommended because of the fragility that it can create. And yet here we are asking the question about how well the Word of Wisdom holds up to scientific scrutiny in 2026. But here's my answer of why I'd say this is worth discussing. Doctrine and Covenants 89 is really unique among Latter-day Saint canonized scripture in a very specific way. Like it makes behavioral claims that are empirically testable. This is not always true with the Revelations, but this one is. It doesn't just say, like, believe this. It doesn't say worship in this way. It says, in effect, these substances are harmful to your body, and these substances are beneficial. Like those are claims about the physical world. And claims about the physical world can, in principle, be evaluated against physical evidence, right?
Right. It's not like we're running a controlled experiment on the Sermon on the Mount, which we really couldn't do, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if the text is making health claims, then it's not disrespectful to take those health claims seriously. In fact, I would argue it's more respectful to engage them honestly and seriously than it is to treat them as though they're beyond scrutiny somehow, right?
Yeah, and for church members that are listening to this podcast, this isn't really an abstract question. People encounter this stuff all the time. You have a colleague who drinks coffee every morning and is in better health than you are, and he's 65. You read about the Mediterranean diet and notice that it includes moderate amounts of things that the Word of Wisdom prohibits. You hear about a study on green tea and cancer prevention, and you wonder quietly, and maybe with a little bit of guilt, so what do I do with that?
Yeah, and I think one of the worst things we could do as church members is to pretend that tension doesn't exist, because I think we all sense it, right? So what we want to do today is try to offer our best framework for thinking about this clearly.
And that's essentially what we're asking. So how does Doctrine and Covenants, Section 89, the Word of Wisdom, hold up to scientific scrutiny?
Yeah, and to organize our thinking, I want to suggest a framework before we start. So when we're evaluating any, we'll call them provisions in the Doctrine and Covenants, any instructions to do or to don't, right? We'll call those provisions. As we're evaluating any provision in D&C 89, there's going to be three possible verdicts we can come to, all right? The first one is that provision is positively supported by modern scientific evidence. Genuine hit, we'll call it a hit. Second, the provision is simply not supported, but it's also not actively contradicted. It's kind of a neutral or unclear kind of a situation. And then the third would be that the provision faces affirmative counter evidence, right? Not just lack of support, but evidence that actively points in the opposite direction than the revelation states. And that third category is the most challenging. It's also the most significant, and we need to figure out how to deal with that head on. Okay.
Yeah. So good framework, positive, neutral, contradicted. All right. So let's start with the good news. So I'm going to go to verse 8 and tobacco.
Okay.
Where do you start with tobacco, Scott?
Let's start with the 1833 baseline. Okay. So because that's what makes this provision so striking. Like when we covered this in our first episode, we talked about how the fact that tobacco was not just culturally accepted in 1833, sometimes it was actually medically recommended, which is so odd to our minds today. But physicians, like get this, physicians actually prescribed tobacco smoke for respiratory ailments in 1833. There were popular beliefs that tobacco helped to clear the lungs. And so the idea that tobacco was, in Section 89's words, not for the belly, was not the consensus position. It was a minority view, and in many medical circles, it was a fringe view.
Right. And so when people today try to explain Doctrine and Covenants 89 as Joseph Smith just sort of synthesizing the best of the health reform literature around him, which is a real argument that historians make, and we take it seriously, the tobacco provision is the hardest case for that argument to handle, because the best of the 1833 health reform literature was not saying that.
Okay, so tobacco not for the body. That seems like a hit, right? That is a hit for Joseph Smith. Like fast forward to 2026, and the causal evidence linking tobacco to disease is among like the most robust in all of epidemiology, right? We're talking about lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, oral cancer, like a whole range of pathologies. And we know it's actually causal, right? This isn't just a correlation finding. That like the mechanistic pathways are well understood. We understand actually why tobacco does what it does to the body, and it's not good.
Yeah. And here's what's kind of mind-blowing about this. The history of that scientific case being built, it's a 20th century story. The landmark studies establishing tobacco's causal role in lung cancer came out in the 1950s. The Surgeon General's report was in 1964. The tobacco companies fought it for decades. And Joseph Smith doesn't have any of that. He didn't
Right.
have the epidemiology. He didn't have the mechanistic biology. And yet the text says clearly tobacco is not for the body.
Yeah, what I find so fascinating about that is that in the Doctrine and Covenants, it doesn't say, quote, tobacco causes lung cancer. It doesn't use that language, right? It just says it's not for the body, and it doesn't explain the mechanism as to why. And that sort of absence of a specified mechanism kind of makes this provision it's kind of more mysterious, but it's also more impressive in retrospect, not less, right? It seems to vindicate that this is an inspired provision, right? The mechanism wasn't known, but the behavioral conclusion, don't use this, turned it out to be exactly right.
Yeah. So, okay, that's a hit.
That's a hit. Yeah.
All right, let's keep going. Alcohol.
Okay.
Let's talk about alcohol, because this is the one where the evidence has actually shifted in a really interesting way, maybe just in the last decade or so.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Yeah, there was a period roughly from like the 1990s through, let's say, like the early 2010s, when the dominant medical consensus was that a moderate amount of alcohol consumption has a protective effect on cardiovascular health. You remember the whole a glass of wine a day is good for your heart?
I had a student,
right? Like I heard that.
A ninth grade student bring that up in class once. And I was like, why are you even asking me about wine, kid? You're 14 years old. Anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes this is framed in the literature as a J curve. I've been just researching the bejeebies out of this. It's called a J curve, Casey, where it basically says heavy drinking is very bad. No drinking is slightly worse than moderate drinking. And moderate drinking sits in the sweet spot, right? That's where that idea came from. And it's familiar to a lot of us, right?
Right. That famous a glass of red wine is good for your heart thing. And I know a lot of Latter-day Saints kind of had to sit with that for a while because the science seemed to be pointing against a total prohibition.
Right. And then here's what happened. A type of study called a Mendelian randomization happened. And I know that's a really nerdy technical term. But I want to explain it the best I understand. I'm not that kind of doctor, but it's basically this. It uses genetic variants as sort of a natural experiment. So some people, because of their genetics, metabolize alcohol faster or slower than others. So they're not correlated with other lifestyle factors the way that, say, people who drink moderately are different from people who choose to not drink at all, kind of a thing, right? So you can use those genetic differences to approximate something like a controlled experiment. And these have been done with large numbers of people.
And what did those studies find? What are the results?
Yeah, so when you use that methodology and you include cancer risk in the outcomes, not just cardiovascular disease, then that protective J curve they talked about totally disappears. So in a groundbreaking study, just in 2018, Casey, it's called the Lancet. It's the 2018 Lancet meta-analysis. It pooled data from a huge number of studies across populations, and it concluded that the safest level of alcohol consumption is 0. Alcohol, they call it a group 1 carcinogen, right? They say that this moderate drinking is fine consensus that has been dominating the conversation for the last 30 years is not true. Now that narrative is in serious retreat, just as of 2018.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, Doctrine and Covenants 89's total prohibition on drinking, no strong drink for the belly, actually looks more defensible in 2026 than it did in, say, 2005.
Right? It's very recent. That's the honest scientific assessment. Yeah. And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, right? Think about that. Like the revelation that seemed out of step a little bit with emerging science just 30 years ago is now like in lockstep alignment with where the science is going. That's not nothing, Casey. I'd call that a direct hit.
Yeah, and there's actually something else in the alcohol verse that I want to make sure that we don't skip over, because I think it's one of the most quietly remarkable details in the whole revelation. Verse 7 doesn't just say strong drinks are not for the belly. It says they're not for the belly, but for the washing of your bodies.
Ooh, okay, yeah, that's a hit that gets almost no attention in popular discussions of the word of wisdom.
Yeah, so let's explain why is that significant?
Well, yeah, for one thing, in 1833, germ theory of disease did not exist. Right? That's a big deal. The idea that microorganisms cause infection, that's like a mid to late 19th century development. And Louis Pasteur, his work on fermentation and pathogens comes in the 1850s and 60s. And a guy named Joseph Lister, who does the pioneering work on antiseptic surgical techniques, using a certain kind of acid to kill germs on surgical instruments. That's 1865. That's 32 years after Doctrine and Covenants 89, right?
Yeah. So in 1833, nobody understood why alcohol killed pathogens on the skin.
Nobody even knew that was like a relevant mechanism. The whole germ theory framework that makes antiseptic practices intelligible didn't even exist. There's no way to like explain to people why that would work, right? Some people cleaned wounds in 1833 for all kinds of reasons, folk practice and tradition, but like a systematic understanding of alcohol as an antiseptic agent comes decades later. Like that's the point. So strong drink is not for internal consumption, but for external application, the washing of bodies. That's a direct hit. Word of wisdom.
Yeah, and that distinction, internal versus external, is exactly the distinction that modern medicine draws. You don't drink rubbing alcohol, you wash wounds with it.
Yeah, and the verse isn't recommending that people marinate themselves in whiskey. It's just making a fundamental distinction, that the same thing that modern medicine endorses 100%. Use it topically, not internally. Well established now in medical practice, not established at all in 1833.
And here's another big thing about this. Think about what that would have looked like to someone in 1833. There's no framework for understanding why washing a wound with alcohol might be different from drinking it. Mm-hmm. The germ theory wasn't there. The biochemistry wasn't there. The distinction just appears in the text. Behavioral instruction that turns out to be exactly right for reasons that wouldn't be scientifically explainable for another 3 decades.
Yeah. That's one of the more striking details about the whole like revelation when you slow down and think about it. And I think this belongs in the same category as the tobacco prohibition, right? It's a provision that's stated without mechanistic justification. In other words, it doesn't explain why you shouldn't eat tobacco or why you shouldn't drink alcohol or why you should put alcohol on your skin. It just states it. It just states to do it or to not do it. And then later on, the science seems to vindicate that, right?
Yeah, it turns out that it's correct. So, yeah. Okay, that's a hit. Now, we should mention the plant and grain emphasis more briefly. That's verses 10 through 14. That fruits, herbs, grains are foundational parts of a person's diet.
Okay, so where does that land?
That's probably what I call a qualified hit. The broad direction that basically a plant-forward diet with grains as the central component is consistent with the bulk of nutritional science. The large dietary pattern studies, the Mediterranean diet literature, the DASH diet work, all of it broadly supports prioritizing plants, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. And the text is vague enough that it's hard to say it's making falsifiable scientific claims, but the directional arrow is right.
Yeah, true.
So that part's kind of a qualified hit, right?
I like that.
It's vague, but okay. So now we're going to get to maybe the difficult part, the stuff that doesn't age as well. So in verse 12, it says that flesh, meaning meat, is to be used sparingly. And then there's this qualifier in verse 13 that it's appropriate in times of winter or of cold or famine. So let's start there.
Yeah. Okay. So there's actually 2 distinct things happening in those verses, and they have 2 different verdicts, I would say. The meat sparingly instruction is actually broadly consistent with modern nutritional advice, right? Like there are well-established associations between high consumption of red and processed meat and colorectal cancer. Cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality. So the general direction of don't eat a lot of meat is defensible. I'd call that a partial hit.
Yeah. But, and I sense a but coming.
but there's that seasonal qualifier that meat is appropriate in times of winter or cold. So that actually has no basis in modern biochemistry. Your protein requirements don't change with the temperature outside, it turns out. That's not how human physiology works. And I think it's a really instructive detail, actually, because it's a place where you can see 1833 thermal physiology thinking, this idea that the body needs more fuel in cold weather, that cold weather changes what's appropriate to consume. Like that idea bleeds into the text here.
Let me bring up something that sometimes is brought up. It seems like other than Joseph F. Merrill, people haven't really emphasized this part of the word of wisdom for a long time. And I've had some people,
we saw, right? Lorenzo Snow and Joseph F. Merrill. Are they the only two?
Yeah,
basically?
yeah. And Lorenzo Snow's argument was that animals have spirits, so we should eat as little meat as possible. That's the argument he makes. What about like refrigeration technology? Like, is there a reason maybe why this hasn't been emphasized by modern leaders of the church? Whereas in 1833, they don't have anywhere to freeze their meat. So only eat it in times of winter. Is that a possible explanation here?
In my deep dive and trying to understand like the 1833 thinking here, they had this understanding of this thermal basis for the body. I can't remember their explanation the phrase they use for it, but the idea is that when your body gets too hot, then disease is more likely. And when you eat meat, it makes your body more hot. So when would be the appropriate times to eat meat? Well, during winter time, when you kind of have that contrasting cool weather, you can eat meat because then you're not going to get too hot and get too much disease. Is part of the thinking of the day. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but I think that's an interesting line of thought in the day that may be reflected in the text here.
Maybe, yeah. And if that's what they're reflecting, then I'll say that's a miss. Like, it doesn't seem like it matters if it's winter or summer. Okay. Fair enough.
No modern nutritional science supports varying meat consumption based on the outside temperature. Yeah, I think that's not there today.
Okay. So what about, let's say, the grain species assignments? This is part of Doctrine and Covenants 89 that, frankly, isn't emphasized very much when people discuss the Revelation, verses 14 through 17, right?
Yeah, those are the verses that say, like, wheat for man, corn for the ox, oats for the horse, rye for the fowls, barley for mild drinks. Right? And I want to state this one pretty clearly too. Like there is no biological hierarchy in these assignments that modern nutritional science supports. Oats, for instance, which the text assigns to horses, are actually among the most well-evidenced grains for human health. To get nerdy here, the beta-glucan content in oats, Casey, has a causal relationship with LDL cholesterol reduction, for instance. Again, I studied the bejeebies out of this. I used AI. I looked at studies that it pointed me to, but the glycemic profile is excellent for humans. Oats are superb. Corn, which is assigned to the ox, is also a dietary staple for billions of people worldwide, right? So...
yeah. So why do you think these assignments are in the text then?
Yeah, well, it seems like the most honest answer is that they reflected agricultural folk taxonomy from the 1833s, especially in Ohio. In other words, these were the grains that farmers were using for those purposes. Workhorses ate oats, oxen ate corn. That's just a common agricultural practice. And the text is, I think, just encoding that folk knowledge right into it. This is what grains are for, right? In the form of a dietary code. It's not inspired nutritional science, but it's fitting for an 1833 agrarian culture. So that's just right there, kind of embedded into the text.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to name, not to undermine the revelation, but it helps us understand how the genre of this document works. And there are places where the folk knowledge of 1833 are kind of visibly present. And let me add too, I don't ever remember finding anything that this part of the revelation was emphasized either. I've never heard of anybody being brought before a church council because they fed oats to their ox, right? Or corn
Those are for
to
horses,
their
you
horses or
fool.
anything. So
Yeah.
it does seem like this one is one that you're right. We just kind of brush over, and I've never really put a lot of serious thought into.
Yeah, and I think this has implications for how we interpret the whole Revelation, right? The provisions sometimes seem to track the 1833 culture of the day, and the ones that most closely track the folk culture are also the ones that aged the most poorly, Casey. This is interesting. The ones that cut against 1833 culture, like tobacco and alcohol, and the antiseptic use of alcohol externally, those ones have actually aged the best. So... and we'll talk about some different ways of kind of thinking about this and what this is teaching us about prophets and revelation and culture and context in a minute, but just it's something to kind of sit with for now and kind of think about that.
Yeah. And before we get to the really hard part of this episode, I want to deal with one more myth that is kind of interesting. Verse 8 says tobacco is not for the body. That's a strong hit, as we discussed. But the same verse says it's good for bruises and sick cattle. So what do we do with that?
Yeah, those are two distinct claims. So on tobacco for bruises, this is one that just fascinated me. So I had to just do a deep nerdy dive on this. And here's what I learned. So a bruise is a hematoma, technical term, which is internal bleeding from capillary damage. Okay. There is no mechanism by which tobacco can reduce internal bleeding. There's no way it accelerates the reabsorption of your blood or reduces inflammation in any way that modern pharmacology recognizes. That one's a miss. So the perceived benefit in 1833, which they did use this, was almost certainly a combination of like a placebo response and the moist heat of like a poultice. They would put tobacco, they kind of grind it up in a poultice with some other things, and it was warmed, and they would put it on a bruise. Like we call that folk medicine, right? So they're doing that. Maybe the warmth they felt like was helpful or something, but there is no science that backs up tobacco being helpful for bruises. That's a miss.
What about the cattle part? That it's good for cattle.
That one surprised me. That one's actually a little more complicated because get this, nicotine does actually have genuine anti-parasitic properties. It was used as what they called a vermifuge, and that's not crazy medicine in 1833. So what they would do is they would actually give it when cows were sick. They would give some tobacco to the cows to eat. But here's the problem: the therapeutic index, okay, this is the gap between the dose that will kill the parasite and the dose that will kill the animal, is dangerously narrow because nicotine is a potent neurotoxin. So veterinary medicine has abandoned any tobacco-based treatments today precisely because the effective dose and the lethal dose are uncomfortably close. Modern veterinary pharmacology has replaced any tobacco products entirely with much safer agents. So historically, this is actually kind of defensible in a narrow sense, but it's not defensible today as like a standing recommendation. No.
And again, I want to name what's happening here. We're looking at a specific applied recommendations in the text, and those are the ones that track back to 1833 folk medicine most closely. It's a pattern. And I need to add too, it seems like it's never been emphasized either. Like
ever. Yeah, ever.
I wanted to look and see what John A. Widtsoe said about this, possible uses of tobacco. And in his book, which again was published in 1937, he sort of says, yeah, tobacco is good for bruises, but he doesn't really cite any evidence.
Yeah.
And then with the cattle, he says, and it was a useful parasitic for the time. He qualifies both of those things. But this is another one of those things where it doesn't seem like there's ever been a sermon given in the church on, hey, you should be giving your cows more tobacco, or Joseph Merrill doesn't like ever bring this up, and John A. Widtsoe kind of brushes past it pretty quickly to focus on the negative effects of tobacco on human beings.
Yeah, and in Temple recommend questions when you're asked, do you understand and obey the word of wisdom? I've never heard anyone say, well, I've had some bruising of late, and I have not applied tobacco to it, and therefore maybe not completely compliant. It's like, no,
I have a
doesn't come
confession.
up.
I'm not feeding my cows any tobacco or something like that.
Not on the radar anymore, right? So
but it does show a pattern. There's kind of a pattern emerging here in the text, right?
And I think that's theologically informative, right? But we're going to come back to that in a second, though. So hold that thought.
Okay. So I'm going to bring up the big one because, I've been on several podcasts, been asked about this. Love to Pastor Jeff out there. This was his big thing about the word of wisdom. But coffee and tea, Scott. Let's take a breath before we do this too. This might be the most important part of the episode, and I want to do justice. It seems like a lot of things on the word of wisdom are fairly settled. And some things, like I said, we don't really worry that much about. But this is the one where, at least among the young people that I teach, there's kind of the most contention. Like, why don't we use coffee and tea? What's the big deal? With it?
I agree. Let's try to do this one right.
Yeah. So verse 9, it says, hot drinks are not for the body or the belly. Brigham Young later clarifies, and this is now the standard institutional interpretation, and it's earlier than Brigham Young. I usually hear Hiram Smith. More church leaders than I can, swing a stick at, clarify that hot drinks means coffee and tea. Yeah. And this has been the operative understanding for most of church history, and it's the basis of the current temple recommend question: no coffee and no tea.
Yeah. So the relevant medical question is, what does the modern scientific evidence say about coffee and tea?
Yeah, and this is where we should be honest with everybody that's listening, because this is different than the other misses we've talked about. It's different in kind, not just degree.
Oh, say more about that.
Okay. So the grain species assignments are a miss because there's no support for them. All right. The tobacco poultice is a miss because there's no support for it. In both cases, you could theoretically say, well, maybe future research will vindicate these. There's an absence of support, but not an active body of evidence pointing in the other direction. The coffee and tea prohibition is different. There is an affirmative body of evidence, large, replicated multi-population prospective cohort studies that consistently associates coffee consumption with better health outcomes. Not worse, better.
Yeah, specifically, and I want to name these clearly: reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, reduced risk of Parkinson's disease, reduced risk of liver cirrhosis and liver cancer, reduced risk of endometrial cancer, and associations with lower all-cause mortality, which means like basically people who drink a moderate amount of coffee tend to live longer than people who don't when you control for all other factors. That's wild.
Okay. And tea, especially green and black tea, have similar positive associations with cardiovascular outcomes and certain cancers. And the leading hypothesis involves polyphenols and antioxidants. Again, that's not really a fringe finding. There's not one outlier study. It's a pattern across many populations and methodologies.
And I think we need to say this plainly, like, this is not a case where we can responsibly tell our listeners, Casey, that the science just isn't settled yet. Like, it is. The evidentiary direction on coffee and tea is established. And it points in a direction that is definitely in tension with what the word of wisdom is saying here.
And this is a part where some listeners might be waiting for us to pivot to a reassuring apologetic. And I want to tell you, we're not going to do that. And it's not because we don't care about faith. We care about faith deeply. And we're going to spend the next section of the episode talking about how to hold to this faithfully. But we're not going to pretend that the tension isn't there, because I think when we do that, we actually undermine the trust that makes real faith possible.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like the faithful case actually becomes stronger when you're honest about the tension than when you try to just explain it away. Because, then, you try to do that. And I think we've all seen this, that church members start to feel like you're just telling them what they want to hear rather than what's true. And that actually undermines trust.
Yeah. So okay. Coffee and tea. The prohibition on coffee and tea faces affirmative counter evidence. That's the honest assessment. So what do we do with this?
Yeah, good question. And there's actually a couple of different responses to this. So maybe we could start by mapping out kind of the landscape of responses to this, because I think there are several moves that people make when they encounter this kind of tension. And I think some of them are better than others, honestly, Casey. So maybe let's just name a few that maybe we should set aside.
I'd probably start with the single most important, the honest acknowledgement. The most credible thing a faithful scholar can do is to concede the misses as real misses, not soften them and not reframe them as provisional, accept them on the evidentiary terms that the evidence establishes.
Okay, and then what?
And then you do the careful work of weighing the full picture rather than cherry picking. Like, let me cite someone, Terrell Givens, who I think is among the most careful, faithful scholars working today, has this framing that I keep coming back to. His argument, roughly, is that faith is not the absence of tension with evidence. It's the willed orientation maintained in the presence of it. You don't need every piece of data to fit the theistic hypothesis. You need to weigh the overall balance, and that's an honest position. That's a position a philosopher of religion would recognize.
Yeah, exactly. I like that. Yeah, and in fact, let me give you a few specific arguments that I think have like real analytical content in that direction, pieces of data. And the first, I would call it the limited scope argument. This is something to think about, honestly. I don't think it resolves everything, but just think about that DNC 89 doesn't claim to be a comprehensive nutritional science document, right? What it claims to be, in its own words, is a principle with a promise. There's a behavioral code aspect to it addressed to specific questions, as we talked about in our first episode, that were live issues in 1833. And that's what I find interesting. Like, look at which provisions aged well in the document and which ones don't, right? And the provisions that are stated behaviorally without any mechanistic specifics, right? Tobacco is not for the body, strong drinks are not for the belly, alcohol is for washing. Those are the ones with the best modern support. And then the provisions that encode specific applications, like tobacco for bruises, grain hierarchies, oats for horses, etc. The seasonal meat qualifier. That's where the 1833 folk knowledge bleeds in most visibly, right? Tobacco for bruises and for cows. There's just these two different kinds of assessments there.
Yeah, that's an important distinction.
Yeah, I think it actually predicts the pattern in the data, right? That I think any faithful Latter-day Saint could argue that the behavioral instructions, the core of what the revelation is asking people to do, have a much stronger evidential track record than the specific 1833 embedded cultural things, right? That's not nothing. That's not nothing, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. So what about the second argument, the one that is comparing Doctrine and Covenants 89 to just sort of the baseline 1833 health thinking, like the common knowledge of the time?
Yeah, and this is the differential hit rate argument, some could call it, right? Meaning, so if the question is, what's the base rate? Like if you randomly sampled health claims from the best 1833 reform literature, okay, the temperance societies, the Grahamites, the popular medical guides of the day, how many of those claims hold up against modern evidence today?
And the answer to that is not many of them, not a lot of them, to be honest with you.
Not many, yeah. Like the 1833 medical consensus is like, it includes stuff like bloodletting. I don't think we talked about this one enough in our first episode. I think that's how George Washington died, right? They had this theory that if you got too much blood in your body, then you would get sick. And so some doctors would literally like cut you and start to drain some of your blood as like a way to help you get better. Wild. Like calomel as a universal treatment, this mercury powder they would give you when you're sick. Like that's how Alvin Smith died because of calomel, right? It's like, oh my word. There's miasma theory, where there's a theory that like if you inhale stinky air or like pale smelling air or something like that, then that would make you sick. It's interesting. Heroic medicine, that's the stuff about, again, the body temperature and how that is related to being sick or not. Like all of that stuff has aged catastrophically, Casey. Like some of the most prominent physicians during this era were actually unwittingly killing their patients with treatments that we now know are harmful. And against that baseline, if we call that the baseline, then Doctrine and Covenants 89's hit rate, 2 strong hits, 2 qualified hits, and just a set of misses, which are mostly in the cultural specifics, is actually better than what you'd expect from a random sampling of this era, right? If we're just looking at it like statistically there.
Yeah. And crucially, the 2 strong hits are on the provisions where the 1833 consensus runs against what the Word of Wisdom is saying. That's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, totally. Like if Joseph Smith was just synthesizing the best available knowledge in 1833 Reformed thinking, we would expect him to agree by and large with the consensus, not cut against it. The tobacco prohibition in particular is just hard to explain as cultural synthesis. It wasn't what the best thinkers were saying about tobacco at the time.
Yeah, and I want to add a thought here before we get to the coffee question specifically, because I think this is important now. Everything we've said about the hit rate and the limited scope and the behavioral framing, that's real. Those arguments have content, but none of them individually is a knockdown proof of anything. They're a cumulative case. And I think that's the posture we want our listeners to walk away with. Not, here is the argument that resolves all the tension, but here's how to weigh the full picture honestly, in an honest way.
Yeah, well said. So that leads us, I guess, to let's talk coffee and tea. Okay. What about the coffee and tea prohibition specifically then, with that in mind?
Yeah.
Because the other arguments that we made, they help with the grain assignments. They help with the seasonal meat qualifiers. But the coffee and tea prohibition is different, as we said. The scientific evidence today points in the wrong direction, some might say, right? And I don't think the packaging argument or the limited scope argument really fully resolves that.
Okay. So what do we do with it?
Well, let me throw this out there. I want to offer a framing that I think is more honest than most of what we find in popular treatments about this question, and it's just this: for the provisions that are actively contradicted by modern evidence, coffee and tea, I think the most defensible, faithful position to take is to locate the reason for continued observance of those things, not in the medical or scientific domain, but in the covenantal domain, Casey.
Okay, the covenantal domain, not the medical domain. Yeah. Unpack that a little bit. What do you mean?
Like, think about other religions. I teach world religions, and I'm fascinated by them. And there are, for instance, among the Jews, I think we're most familiar with them. They have a kosher law, right? There's others. Muslims have another kind of a dietary law as well. Sikhs have a similar dietary law. Buddhists have prohibitions on meat for certain communities, right? None of them are justifying these food prohibitions or drink prohibitions by nutritional science. No Jew says you should keep kosher because the science shows it's healthier. Like, nobody says that. The observance, in other words, it becomes a boundary practice. It marks the community, right? It shapes identity. It enacts covenant relationship and covenant seriousness with God. And so I think that function is real and it's meaningful, even if the specific dietary rules don't track optimal nutritional science today. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what you're kind of saying is that the Word of Wisdom can function that way, in the covenantal sense.
Yeah. And I'm saying that for provisions where the medical case is the weakest, and the coffee and tea prohibition is the clearest example, I think the honest answer for why we would continue to live the Word of Wisdom in that area is we observe it not primarily because it's medically defensible, but because it's a covenant marker, right? And I think, Casey, if I remember right, in your discussions with Pastor Jeff, you ended here, didn't you? Like you talked
I
about,
sort of did. Yeah,
it's about covenant. It's because we promised that we wouldn't, right? I mean,
yeah. And I had to be honest with Pastor Jeff and say, we don't think you're a bad person because you drink coffee and tea.
No.
You haven't made the same covenants as me. And so I don't think that it's a sin when Pastor Jeff drinks coffee or tea.
Right.
But it would be for me because I've promised to not do that. It's a covenant that I've made. And I'm not doing it for specifically health reasons, but for, like you said, covenantal reasons. I think that's a good, honest answer to give.
And that's a different kind of reason, right? It's not, I do it because it's better for my health. I do it because of covenant, and that's not arbitrary. In some ways, I think that's a richer reason. And so I think on this issue, Casey, one of the worst things we could do is to tell church members, don't worry, the coffee prohibition is medically well supported, when the evidence actually doesn't support that claim. Like, we should be careful about that. That will erode trust the moment somebody goes and reads the literature, right? So I think the better move here is to say, here's what the evidence shows. Here's the honest tension, like we've tried to point out today. And here's why we still continue to observe this anyway. The reason isn't primarily medical.
Yeah. And let me add one more thing here, and then we'll move on to the so what section.
Yeah.
There's a phrase in the Revelation itself that I keep coming back to. It's in verse 2. It describes this as a, quote, principle with a promise. That's the word, a principle with a promise, not a medical treatise. It's not a comprehensive health science document. It's a principle with a promise. And the promise isn't that you will live longer than your coffee drinking neighbors. The promise is something more like wisdom, health in a holistic sense, and what the text calls hidden treasures of knowledge. And I don't know exactly what that means, but it sort of gestures at something bigger than optimized biomarkers. And maybe that's the frame the whole document is meant to be read within.
Yeah, I think that's right. I like that. And I think the posture of engaging it honestly like that, including the hard parts, is itself a form of that. It's a form of honesty, and it's a form of seeking wisdom rather than just reassurance, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, and let's talk about a couple of important takeaways. First, if you came to this episode worried that the science was going to demolish the word of wisdom, it doesn't. The tobacco and alcohol prohibitions are in the most honest assessment among the most well-supported behavioral health instructions in 19th century religious literature. The tobacco prohibition in particular ran against the 1833 medical consensus and turns out to be exactly right. The alcohol verse distinguishes internal consumption from external use in a way that precisely tracks with modern science. And that was decades before germ theory made that distinction scientifically intelligible. That matters. These are not small things, Scott.
Yeah. And at the same time, if you came to this episode hoping that we were going to tell you, actually, everything checks out perfectly, we also can't say that either. The grain species assignments reflect 1833 agricultural folk culture. The seasonal meat qualifier really has no modern basis. And the coffee and tea prohibition especially faces an established body of affirmative counter evidence. Those things are true. And as faithful members of the church, we need to look at them carefully, we think.
Yeah. And I think what I find most meaningful when I step back and look at the whole picture is this. The pattern in the evidence is theologically interesting. The provisions that age best are the ones that are stated as behavioral instructions without this kind of mechanistic justification. The provisions that age worst are the ones where specific 1833 cultural knowledge bleeds in. That's consistent with a model of revelation in which divine signal comes through a human vessel. And the human vessel's existing vocabulary and cultural framework shape the specific form the revelation takes. Like we mentioned earlier, Doctrine and Covenants 124 says that the Lord speaks to us after the manner of our language that we might come to understanding.
It's so important. And it's right there in D&C 1, right? Like, it's almost like, this is how I want you to read all the revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants. It says something about the nature of revelation. And what I find so fascinating about that is that it doesn't require misses in the revelations, like we've talked about today, to be embarrassments. They're actually informative. They help us understand the genre of the revelation itself and the model of revelation that we claim in the church, right? That God actually communicates through humans in their language, inside their human conceptual frameworks, and the texts that are produced in that process are going to have human fingerprints on them, right? So you don't throw out the revelatory baby with the human bathwater here, right?
Good analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a feature of how the Latter-day Saint tradition understands revelation to work. This is not a bug, right? We've always talked throughout this podcast, Casey, that the human and the divine are intertwined in ways that are not always easily discernible.
Yeah, yeah. And for those listeners who are carrying real questions about coffee specifically, let me just address this for a moment too. The honest answer is that the medical case for prohibition is not strong. The evidentiary direction is against it. You're not misreading the science. If you've sensed that tension, you're reading it correctly. And the reason you still observe the prohibition, if you do, or the reason that the church asks you to, is not because of medical evidence. It's because of the covenants that you've made. Because of what it means to belong to this community and to keep promises within the community.
Yeah, and I don't think that's us imposing that on the text, Casey. I actually think the very last verse of section 89, which remarkably we haven't talked about this entire series, actually points us in this direction, right? It's verse 21, and it's easy to rush past it, but listen to what it says. This is where the Lord promises those who keep the word of wisdom that, quote, the destroying angel shall pass by them as the children of Israel and not slay them.
Yeah. That is very specific language that invokes a very specific event. That's Passover imagery.
The Passover imagery, exactly. And think about what that allusion is actually doing here. The Lord isn't pointing to a randomized control trial, right? He's pointing to the night in Egypt when the firstborn sons of Israel were preserved. Not because the Israelites had scientific evidence that smearing blood on their doorposts would protect them from a destroying angel epidemic, right? It's because they trusted God. That's the whole point. Obedience as covenant faithfulness, not obedience as scientifically validated health strategy. You sense the difference there, right?
Yeah. I mean, nobody in the Exodus story, nobody in Egypt was saying, well, look at me. Let me look at the data on lamb's blood and door frames before I commit to this. That wasn't the framework.
Exactly. Yeah, they did it because they trusted the God who was asking it of them. And the promise that followed was real. Protection, preservation, safety, and really importantly, belonging to a people who had been redeemed by God and set apart because of their willingness to act on faith. And I just find it fascinating that verse 21 ends the revelation that way. That's the paradigm that the revelation invokes in the very last passage. Not a biomedical promise, it's a covenantal one.
Yeah. And I also think that's the most honest and frankly, the most spiritually compelling answer to the question we've been sitting with this entire episode. As interesting as the scientific exploration of the word of wisdom is, and it is genuinely interesting, and we hope this episode has been interesting. At the end of the day, that's not why we observe it. That's not why we do what we do. We observe it the way the children of Israel put blood on their doors, not because a study confirmed it, because we made a covenant with a God we trust. And we keep that covenant as a mark of who we are and whose we are.
And I'll just add this, that the posture we're trying to model in this episode of engaging honestly and conceding what's genuinely contradicted by the science and weighing the full picture here. Like, we think this is an act of faithfulness, of intellectual study and covenantal faith, like we're invited to do in section 88, study and faith. And I don't think intellectual honesty and faith are opponents here. We've never even suggested that for a minute. We pushed against that our entire time together in this podcast, Casey. But we think intellectual honesty is a form of faith, and the willingness to look clearly at difficult, controversial things, and then to continue to keep your covenants anyway, not because you've explained everything away, but because the cumulative weight of our experience and the cumulative weight of the evidence that we've considered actually points to something real, right? I think that's what we would call mature faith, right? It's what Terrell Givens was talking about when he talks about faith is choosing God even in the midst of tensions. You're acknowledging the tensions and you're continuing to move forward in faith. And I think the word of wisdom held in this way is actually a richer revelation than just the simpler version that we sometimes teach, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, it is. And it's a richer covenant than the simpler version, too. Doctrine and Covenants 89 is not a perfect biomedical document. It's also not a confused cultural relic. It's something more complicated and more interesting than either of those. It's a covenant invitation. It embedded in a particular historical moment, pointing toward a way of life that's about more optimized health outcomes. And that complexity doesn't have to shake our faith. When we hold it clearly, I think it can deepen it.
Yeah. Well said. So we leave these thoughts with you, dear listener, to ponder, especially just consider that last verse, the Passover allusion. Let that image kind of linger in your mind. The wisdom that comes from keeping covenants, the preservation that comes not from having all the answers, but from trusting a God who does.
Yeah, that's exactly where I think I want to leave it.
Yeah, the word of wisdom has always been more than just a health code. At its best, maybe we can consider it an invitation to take your body seriously, yes. To take your covenants seriously, also yes. And to trust the God who gave that law to keep his promises to us. And I think that invitation holds up just fine.
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, all right, friends. Thank you so much for being with us on this series. It's been one of the most meaningful stretches of episodes I think we've done. And your engagement on this, the questions that you send means the world to us. We mentioned this whole series was prompted because we got so many questions on it to begin with. Let's keep the conversation going. So, share this with someone who's been asking questions about the word of wisdom. These conversations are worth having. So thank you, Scott. I guess we'll see you next time.
All right. We'll see you in our next series, Casey. Thanks so much, man.